Welcome to Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. Hosted by Irving Risch. Light from the land of the Sphinx. Chapter 24, The Covenant Made. Having uttered the 10 Commandments, Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 13, of his law, God added no more. Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 22. He wrote him Exodus chapter 31 verse 18, himself, and the law abides forever in its integrity, unaltered and unalterable. It allows of no escape from its demands. Its terms are precise, this day, and thou shalt live, Luke chapter 10 verse 28. Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Galatians chapter 3 verse 10. Our present object, however, is not the demands of the law, but the covenant which, upon this basis, was made between Jehovah and Israel. A most important principle is contained in Israel's entry into this covenant, and one which changed, in certain respects, the relationship between God and his people. Israel had been delivered by Jehovah from Egypt by virtue of the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, the Almighty having bound himself by his own word, but by the covenant Israel came under an obligation to obey God. And so long as the obedience was maintained, God, on his side, was committed to bring Israel into the land. As a matter of fact, Israel did not obey, and the change in God's ways from sovereign favor, which has been before us in Israel's journey from the Red Sea, to his dealings with Israel under the covenant, gives rise to the spirit-raised question, is the law then against the promises of God? Galatians 3:21. Now Israel did not enter Canaan by virtue of obedience to God, nor did they take so much as one step thitherwards from Sinai as an obedient people. Is the law then against the promises of God? No, if the inheritance be of the law, it is no more of promise. Verse 18. Israel's constant rebellion brought him under the hand of divine government, and only because God was faithful to his promise did they eventually reach the possession. Wherefore then serveth the law? Galatians chapter 3 verse 19 once more suggests the Spirit of God. It was added because of transgressions, is the answer, till the seed should come, and to prove to man his sinfulness, see Romans chapter 7 verse 7 and 13, and his weakness, verse 18, and his absolute need of a Savior. It was and is a great educator to teach these moral and spiritual lessons, so hard for man to learn. Israel had retired to their tents. They could not advance Godwards, and once more Jehovah called Moses up to the mount where God was. Exodus chapter 20 verse 21. Moses became mediator between Jehovah and Israel, and, such being the case, God announced through the altar his way for man to approach him. Although there was no way of approach under pure law, there could be through the office of mediator and the sacrifice. Through the altar Jehovah could say, in consistency with his own holiness, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. Verse 24. Moses in due course descended to the camp and communicated to Israel the judgments and instructions which had been committed to him. With one voice the people again answered, all the words which Jehovah hath said will we do. Exodus chapter 24 verse 3. They agreed to enter the covenant, the terms of which were obedience and prosperity, disobedience and ruin. Having their acceptance, Moses prepared for the confirmation of the covenant. A very important feature in the ways of God with man now appears. Moses put all the words of Jehovah, Exodus chapter 24 verse 4, into writing. It is written, was henceforth to mark the authority of the divine communications. Tradition and legend had developed into the grossest abominations on the earth. These were no longer to rule, but a written authority was to speak in unchangeable words. From that date to the present hour, it is written, has been the rule for faith. The book mentioned in which Moses wrote was at this particular time the book of Exodus. It is now very well known that books and libraries were common in Egypt, in Babylonia, and elsewhere, centuries before the time of Moses. The ancient world was well supplied with literature, and it had its compilers and revisers, who studied ancient writings, and who did so with the most reliable precision. The faithfulness of the copies of these old writers, says Professor Sayce, is astonishing. Where a word or character had been lost in the original tablet, the copyist is careful to state there is a lacuna, or a recent lacuna. Where the form of the original character was doubtful, each of its possible later representations is given. God himself wrote the law and the commandment upon the stone tables, and Moses received these divinely written words expressly from God, that he might teach them. Exodus 24:12. We may well imagine with what anxious care these sacred writings would be held by those to whose keeping they were entrusted. These written words are now before us in our Bibles, and their authority is unchangeable. The next morning early, Moses built an altar under the burning mountain, and erected 12 pillars. The altar indicated Jehovah's presence, the pillars stood for Israel. Upon the altar was placed the confirming blood, the death bond, sealing, as it were, the covenant on God's part. Upon the 12 pillars, some of the same blood was cast, confirming the covenant on Israel's part. The written words were again read to the people, who once more responded, "All that Jehovah hath said will we do, and be obedient." Verse 7, and Moses accepted their solemn assent, sprinkling the bond blood upon them, and saying, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which Jehovah hath made with you concerning all these words." Verse 8. The world at large was in no way connected with the covenant. Israel alone had entered into covenant with God. The world outside of which Israel stood, served the gods and worshipped their idols, and went on just as if there were no Jehovah. None the less does it hold good, that wherever a man is brought under the law, by means of the knowledge of its precepts, he is placed under responsibility to God to obey it. But the covenant based upon the law, and the commands of the law, are quite distinct. After the confirmation of the covenant, 70 of the elders of Israel accompanied Moses and Aaron and his 2 eldest sons to Horeb, and in the presence of Jehovah they partook of the covenant meal. They ate of the peace offering in solemn communion with Jehovah, who, as their covenant God, chose to be called the God of Israel. Exodus chapter 24 verse 10. The 70 elders were representative of the people at large, and to them in some way God manifested himself. He was lifted up above them in his majesty, and under his feet was, as it were, the brilliancy of heaven, clear, or transparent, sapphire. He was revealed in the immeasurable whiteness, the purity, of his abode, while the blue pavement they beheld formed his footstool. Far different was this vision of the infinite from that beheld from the valley, where clouds and darkness formed a veil shrouding the profound glory of his light from man's eye. From the mount of God, Jehovah was seen to be dwelling in his own absolute calm and holiness. The covenant was the most solemn agreement made by man with God since the fall. Man in his sinfulness, weakness, and self-ignorance, undertook to obey all the commands of Jehovah, and agreed to gain the reward, or to lose it, by his own subjection or non-subjection to God's commands. Israel's history is written upon the face of the earth. The nation neither entered the land of promise nor remained there through obedience, and on the terms of the covenant, which they broke within a few weeks after receiving. They never will enjoy the favors promised to Abraham. But God will carry out his promise. He will also establish an entirely new covenant with Israel on a new basis, as we are informed, "Behold, the days come, saith Jehovah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith Jehovah, but this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel, after those days, saith Jehovah. I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be the God, and they shall be my people." Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 31 to 33. Referring to these words, the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews says, "In that he saith, a new covenant. He hath made the first old." It served its great end in demonstrating how impossible it is for man to inherit divine blessings by the right of obedience. The old covenant remained for many centuries, but now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. Hebrews 8:13. But the 10 words remain unchanged. The law abides in its integrity, though there no longer exists a compact between God and man, by faithfulness to which man can attain to life and blessedness. The blood of the covenant in which the Christian rejoices, is the sacrificial blood of Christ, Matthew chapter 26 verse 28, by which new covenant all favors are sealed forever to Christ's people by Christ's own blood. In that covenant there is no possibility of failure. By it, all that the infinite love of God to man has planned for man's blessedness, the inheritance which can never fade away, and the capacity to enjoy it, are eternally secured.